The morning light hit Garrett Wynn in the face before he knew where he was. He lay still. His head throbbed with pressure behind the eyes. His mouth tasted like whiskey. He kept his eyes closed. Music, low and distant. Amber light over a bar counter. A voice he could not place. He opened his eyes, started to sit up, stopped. There was warmth beside him. Not a blanket. Something breathing, slow, and even. He turned his head. A woman lay on his pillow, hair loose and pale, sleeping in his white shirt. He recognized her. That was the problem. She opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling for one beat, unhurried, like someone waking in her own home. Then she turned toward him and said, voice still rough with sleep, "You're stronger than I thought you were." Garrett had no idea what that meant. From the way she looked at him, she already knew that. He checked himself. Jeans, undershirt, still dressed from the night before. The coffee maker was running. He didn't remember setting it. The ceiling was his. The apartment was his. He recognized the water stain above the window, the shape of it, the way it spread toward the corner. He was home. He checked his phone. 9 missed calls from the babysitter. One message, "Nola's fine, but where are you?" He set it face down on the nightstand and tried to reconstruct the previous evening in sequence. Des Brown had declared that finishing the first phase of Ashby Tower ahead of schedule was an occasion that required beer, and nobody on the Floor 14 crew had been willing to argue with him. Garrett had said he wasn't going to drink much. He said that every time. Des had been hearing it for 2 years and had stopped responding to it. The bar was 3 blocks from the site. Vinyl stools, a jukebox nobody used without irony, a long counter that smelled like 20 years of spilled drinks and industrial cleaner. Garrett sat at the far end and let the noise of the crew wash over him and drank his first beer slowly. He was tired in the specific way that came from good physical work, wrung out rather than depleted, and he had not intended to talk to anyone he didn't already know. He was thinking about Nola, who was at her grandmother's for the weekend, and who had asked him that morning whether birds felt cold in the rain the same way people did. He had said he didn't know. She had said that was okay, she'd figure it out, and had put on her jacket and gone. He noticed the woman the way you notice something that didn't quite fit a room. She was sitting at the corner of the bar alone, too still for the energy around her. The bar had a particular low-frequency hum to it, all forward lean and loud voices, and she was inside it like a person who had decided to be somewhere else for a while. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was just sitting with her drink, watching nothing. The stool beside her opened up when the crowd shifted. He sat down without thinking about it. She didn't look over. "Long week?" he said. She considered the question longer than it seemed to warrant. "Long month," she said. He nodded. They didn't exchange names. The noise of the bar made everything feel provisional, like none of it would hold outside this room, and so the normal rules didn't fully apply. She had a way of listening that wasn't passive. She was paying attention. Garrett hadn't talked to someone who was paying attention in a long time, and he found himself saying more than he meant to. Des bought another round, then another. Garrett stopped tracking. At some point the lights seemed lower, and the night did what nights sometimes did when you stopped paying careful attention to them. Now he was sitting on the edge of his own bed with 9 missed calls and a woman in his shirt, and none of the fragments in his head added up to anything he could hold completely. He looked at her again. The cold that moved through him wasn't because he didn't recognize her. It was because he did. Saren Ashby, CEO of Ashby Structural Group. The woman whose name appeared on his paycheck every month. The woman the Floor 14 crew called the boss in a tone that landed somewhere between professional respect and unease. Asleep in his bed, in his shirt, he had no idea what to do with that. Saren came out of the bathroom while the coffee was still dripping. She had washed her face and pulled her hair up with something she'd found on the counter. A small blue hair tie of Nola's, slightly too tight for the job. She was still wearing his shirt. She had folded her blouse over her arm. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that felt longer than it was. Garrett set a mug on the table. She sat down across from him. "Okay," he said. "What happened?" It wasn't quite a question. She took it as a request for information and answered it the same way. Around midnight, it had started raining hard. He had apparently volunteered to walk her out. Her car was across the street, but he hadn't made it further than the door before it became clear he was in no condition to navigate a crosswalk. She had called a rideshare. He hadn't been able to recall his address, so she had found his ID in his jacket pocket and given the driver the address from his license. When they got here, he had made it to the bed and gone horizontal almost immediately. His shirt had been hanging by the bathroom door. She had meant to leave, but the app kept cycling and she was tired, and he was already asleep. And she had sat down on the edge of the bed for just a minute. "Nothing happened," she said, in a tone that was neither offended nor defensive, simply factual. Garrett let out a slow breath. "I figured," he said. "Neither would I have let it," she added, not unkindly. "Neither would I," he said. "I just didn't remember enough to be sure." She nodded. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at him across the table. He looked back. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it had weight to it. She asked how old his daughter was. He told her Nola was 7, spending the weekend at her grandmother's. Something in Saren's expression shifted in a way he couldn't quite name. Then, without entirely planning to, he said something about Mara. Not the full story. He never told the full story, just the shape of it. How she had gotten sick when Nola was just a few months old, how the last year had gone, and then the year after, and then the years after that, how some nights it still felt like standing outside a room, looking in through glass, knowing everything on the other side and not being able to reach any of it. How the weight of it had changed over time, from something sharp into something more like weather, present and impersonal and just there. Saren listened to all of it. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say he was brave, or that Mara was lucky to have had him, or any of the other things people said when they didn't know what else to do with someone else's grief. She didn't try to fix the shape of it or move it to a better angle. She just listened. And when he was finished, she said quietly, "She sounds like someone who knew exactly who you were." Garrett looked at her directly. "She was," he said. She stayed for the rest of the coffee and left at 8:15. He walked her to the door. She stopped on the threshold. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee and the rest of it." "Sure," he said. She left. He stood in the doorway and listened to the elevator, and then stood there a little longer. He noticed that he did not want her to go. He noticed this carefully. The way he noticed things that didn't have an obvious place to put them, and then he set it aside and went to do the dishes. Monday came in gray, with a wind off the lake that found the gaps in every jacket no matter how well you zipped it. Garrett was on floor 14 by 6:30, running conduit with 2 of Dez's guys, and for a few hours it was just the work. The clean, solvable world of wire and voltage, of things that either connected or didn't. He had always been able to lose himself in it, and on that particular Monday morning he was grateful for it. Marcus Holt showed up at 9. He came with a clipboard and a site manager from the building firm, the kind of visit that was technically a progress check, but functioned as something else. Garrett had been on enough job sites to know the difference. A real inspection looked at the work. This one looked at the workers. Holt was 49 and moved through the floor with the particular ease of a man who had never had his confidence seriously challenged. He found Garrett near the junction boxes on the east wall. "Win," he said. "Friendly, easy. The way people said things when they wanted you to believe you had the wrong read on them. Hell of a weekend, I hear." "Finished ahead of phase," Garrett said. "I'll take it." Sure. Holt clasped his hands behind his back. "Listen, I just want to say, no judgment from me. The crew, the bar, blowing off steam, that's your business. The thing is, when it involves company personnel at a certain level, it starts to become a little bit everyone's business. The board is watching this project very closely. You understand what I'm saying. It's not about what happened or didn't happen. It's about optics." Garrett looked at him for the first time. "Was that a question?" Holt smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. More of an observation. I'd hate to see a good crew lead put himself in a complicated position. There it was. Not a direct threat, nothing you could point to, just a door held open to show you what was on the other side. He moved on. Des appeared at Garrett's elbow 30 seconds later, pulling on his work gloves. What was that? He was letting me know I should be worried, Garrett said. Des looked over his shoulder at Holt's retreating back. Is he right? Garrett thought about a mug set on a table, a blue hair tie slightly too small for the job, a silence that hadn't asked anything of him. I don't know yet, he said. Hand me that connector. That afternoon, Garrett received an email from HR. His workers' compensation claim from the previous month, a wrist injury from a materials incident on the south side of the floor, had been processed and approved in full. The turnaround was 11 days. These things normally took 6 to 8 weeks and involved at least 2 rounds of supplemental paperwork. He read the email in his truck in the site parking lot, then read it again. At the bottom, in the CC field, a single initial and a last name, S. Ashby. He sat with that for a while. Holt had spent a morning warning him away from her. She had spent 11 days making sure his claim went through before anything could happen to slow it down. He was somewhere in the middle of that, and he hadn't chosen to be, but here he was anyway. He thought about the phone lighting up on the table and her turning it face down without a word. He thought about the way she had held the mug with both hands. He drove home through traffic that was heavier than usual, the kind of slow crawl that normally made him impatient, and today barely registered. He was thinking about patterns, the way a thing could look like one thing up close and like something else entirely when you step back far enough to see the shape of it. Holt warning him away from her in the morning, her making sure his claim went through 11 days earlier. He wasn't sure yet what those two things added up to together, but he was starting to think someone had already decided. The following Saturday, Garrett took Nola to Rush University Medical. He still knew people there, or the place still knew him, which wasn't quite the same thing but felt similar. He had stopped volunteering regularly when the project schedules got heavier and Nola started needing more of what he had left at the end of the day. But there was a boy on the pediatric floor named Owen, 9 years old, who had been there since February with a bone condition that was nobody's fault and wasn't improving quickly. Nola had decided that Owen needed regular updates on the important events of her week, and Garrett had stopped being able to argue with the logic of it. Claire Pruitt was at the nurses' station when they came in. Garrett had known her from the Friday evening rotations, one of the original group who had still been there when he started coming in during the first year after Mara. She was a steady, deliberate woman with reading glasses on a chain and a way of speaking that suggested she had heard most things already and found very few of them alarming. Nola went ahead to Owen's room at a small run, already mid-sentence. Garrett watched her go. He had volunteered at the unit for 3 years after Mara died. Every Friday evening, the same hallway, the same familiar faces at the nurses' station. He had started going because Mara would have wanted him to. He had kept going because it turned out he needed to. There was something about showing up to a place where other people were going through the worst things that had ever happened to them that made the worst things that had ever happened to him feel less like a room he was locked in and more like a room he was passing through. Claire was flipping through something on the counter. She paused. I was going through old storage files last week, she said. There's a letter I thought you might remember. She produced a folder. Inside was a photocopy of correspondence from the unit's archive. 2019, she said. A young woman brought in, after an accident, on I-90. She was with us almost 3 weeks. Sent a letter to the whole unit afterward. A beautiful letter. Claire looked up over her glasses. You wrote back. The unit protocol at the time required you both to use first initials only. Garrett took the photocopy. The handwriting was careful and controlled, the kind that suggested someone who had thought about each sentence before committing it to the page. He remembered writing his own letter vaguely, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with Nola asleep in the next room, a piece of paper in front of him that had taken 40 minutes to start. He had been too raw then to write about anything directly, so he had written around the edges of things instead. At the bottom of the photocopy, The signature read only S. He had seen that handwriting recently. On a business card left on his kitchen table, on a workers' compensation approval form with a brief notation in the margin. The same slant, the same way the lowercase letters connected to one another, the same capital S, the curve of it familiar now in a way it hadn't been the first time he'd seen it. He asked if Claire knew what had happened to the patient after she was discharged. No, Claire said. They don't always tell you. He said goodbye and went down the hall to find Nola, who was in the middle of explaining something to Owen with the full conviction of a 7-year-old who had done extensive research. Garrett stood in the doorway and listened. He thought about a letter he had written 6 years ago, in the middle of the night, at a kitchen table that was quieter than anything he had ever known. He thought about a woman who had kept that letter, who had opened and refolded it enough times to soften the paper at the creases, who had signed her name with only an initial and apparently carried the rest of it for 6 years without saying so. He texted the number from the back of the business card, while Nola was inside saying goodbye to Owen. I need to ask you something. Not work-related. The response came in 3 minutes. Floor 22. 6 o'clock. He dropped Nola at his mother's for the evening, changed out of his work clothes, and drove downtown. The executive floor was empty when he arrived. The assistants gone, the overhead lights on their evening setting, the whole place suspended in the particular quiet of a building that was resting. Saren was standing at the window that faced the lake. She turned when he came in but didn't move toward him. He put the photocopy on the desk between them without saying anything. She looked down at it and was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down and he sat across from her, and she said, "In May of 2019, I was driving back from a client dinner. It was raining. I came around a curve on I-90 and there was a truck stopped in my lane without lights." She said it the way you spoke about something that had been processed thoroughly enough to become neutral on the surface, though not quite all the way through. I woke up 3 days later in the ICU. She was quiet for a moment. The board was making calls around me. My father wanted to fly in. I kept telling everyone I was fine. I wasn't fine. I had never not been fine before. I didn't know what to do with it. She told him the unit had sent flowers, a basket, cards, and then one envelope addressed in handwriting with no return address. The letter talked about a baby, 8 months old, asleep in a stroller in the hallway because her father came every Friday evening and couldn't afford a sitter. It talked about why he kept coming back, about his wife, about what it felt like to do something because the person you loved would have wanted you to, even when it cost you something to do it. I read it, she said. More times than I should probably tell you. How many times? He asked. He didn't know why he asked. He just wanted to know. She looked at him directly. At least 20. Through the window, the last of the light was leaving the lake. When your file came across my desk in 2023, she said, with your daughter's name and her birth year, and her mother's year of death, I knew. I knew immediately. You've known for 2 years, he said. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? It came out flat, not as an accusation, but as a real question that needed a real answer. She took a breath. Because I didn't know what you would want me to say. You wrote that letter as an anonymous act. I received it the same way. If I'd told you, it would have changed something that I didn't want to change. He sat with this. Then he said, "Do you still have it?" She opened the center drawer of her desk and took out an envelope. Not a photocopy. The original. The paper was slightly soft from handling, the fold worn from being opened and closed many times. He recognized his own handwriting the way you always did, not as something read, but as something known. "Okay," he said, very quietly. She nodded once. "Okay," she said. Des found Garrett in the parking structure below the site 2 days later, standing between 2 panel vans, speaking at the volume of someone who had been watching carefully for longer than he'd let on. Holt filed a formal concern with the executive team, Des said. Something about the CEO's conduct. Conflict of interest. Precedent for personnel boundaries. The language is careful and institutional, and hard to argue with on its face. He looked at Garrett steadily. This isn't just about Saturday night. That was just the handle he found. What does he actually want? Whatever she's standing between him and, that's what it looks like from down here. Garrett went up to floor 22 that afternoon. Saren was at the window. She turned when he came in and didn't ask how he knew. She told him plainly. 6 board members. 2 were reliably hers. 1 was Holt's outright. The other 3 had been carefully cultivated by Holt over the past 6 months, and he was now calling in what he had built. If the board voted to open a formal investigation into the CEO, Ashby Tower would be placed on administrative hold pending resolution. Timelines, contract penalties, the entire crew out of work while lawyers sorted through it. He's been positioning himself since January at least, she said. I underestimated how organized he was, and he's not doing this alone. There's a capital group that has been circling this company for 3 years. They've made offers. My father rejected all of them. If Holt forces a vote of no confidence, they get their opening. He gets a seat at the table in whatever comes after. That's the arrangement. Saturday night was always going to be used for something. He just needed the right handle. Garrett took that in. Do you have documentation on the materials changes? The spec substitutions he ran without going through you? Not enough to shift the board on their own. What if you had more? He paused. Des keeps records. Every time someone changes a spec without going through proper channels, he logs it. Has for years, ever since a job in 2008 where the electricians took the blame for a project manager's unauthorized substitutions. If Holt was running materials decisions off the books, Des has the trail. She studied him. I can't ask you to do this, she said. You didn't ask, Garrett said. I'm going to talk to Des. If the trail is there, I'll bring it to you, and you decide what to do with it. He held her gaze. She looked at him for a long moment, reading the layers of what was being said, not just the surface. Then she nodded once. Be careful with him. Des has no obligation here. He'll want to be in it, Garrett said, when he understands what's actually happening. He left her there, and took the elevator down, and walked out into the early evening. Garrett thought about what Des had said as he walked toward the parking structure. Whatever she's standing between him and, he thought about Holt's hands clasped behind his back. The ease of a man who had been planning something long enough that the planning had become the natural shape of his days. He thought about the workers' comp claim going through in 11 days. He was beginning to understand that there were people who moved through the world, deciding what things meant before the facts were in, and people who waited. He had always been the second kind. He found Des that evening on the tailgate of his truck in the parking structure, eating a sandwich he had apparently bought 3 hours earlier and mostly forgotten about. You know we've been keeping those emails, Des said before Garrett had finished explaining. Garrett looked at him. Every time that man changed a material spec without going through proper channels, I logged it. Des set the sandwich down. I worked a job in 2008 where a project manager made 12 unauthorized substitutions, shaved $300,000 off the budget, and when the ceiling failed, the inquiry pointed straight at the electricians. I've kept records on every job since, every change, every override, every time someone tried to move a number without a signature to back it up. How many are we talking? 27 emails. Minimum. He paused. I've got more than that. They drove to the Ashby Group building together, Des behind the wheel. It was past 8 when they arrived. The building's lower floors were dark. Saren met them in the lobby herself. Des noticed this and said nothing about it, which was one of the things Garrett had always appreciated about him. They spread everything across the conference table on floor 22. Des's logs, the email chains, the change orders with Holt's direct instruction bypassing Saren's approval chain, 31 unauthorized specification changes in total. Not one had followed proper process. Each one had redirected a portion of the materials budget toward a supplier that, when Saren pulled the vendor file, turned out to share a registered address with an LLC whose beneficial owner had not been disclosed. He wasn't just cutting corners, Saren said. She had a pen in her hand and was moving through the documents with the focused energy of someone who had finally found solid ground after standing in water for too long. He was pulling money out. That's what it looks like, Des said. You've had this the whole time. I had what I had. I didn't know what I was looking at until right now. Garrett had worked beside enough people to know the difference between someone performing competence and someone who actually had it. Saren had it. She moved through the documents the way he moved through a wiring diagram. Systematically, nothing missed. Every connection tested before moving to the next one. He found himself adjusting the speed of his own work to match hers, and at some point the three of them had settled into a rhythm, Des on one end, Saren and Garrett working toward the middle, the city quiet outside. Saren kept working. Garrett sat across from her and went through each document she flagged, cross-referencing dates against the project timeline. At some point, it was past 10 o'clock. The city outside had gone dark. She reached for a folder at the same moment. He reached for the same folder, and their hands came to rest on the edge of it at the same time, and neither of them moved away. Des was looking at something at the far end of the table and did not appear to notice. They stayed until nearly 11. By the time they were finished, Saren had a documented pattern of unauthorized financial decisions, a paper trail pointing to a vendor relationship that had never been disclosed, and an independent internal audit that she had, as it turned out, quietly initiated 3 weeks prior. "You started the audit 3 weeks ago," Garrett said. "I suspected something," she said. "I didn't know what." Des stood, gathered his copies, and looked between the two of them with an expression of profound neutrality. "You good here?" "We're good," Garrett said. Des left. The elevator opened and closed. The office was quiet. Saren looked at the documents spread across the table, then looked at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. He started stacking the files into order. She picked up a pen and helped. The board convened 3 days later. Garrett did not attend. There was no reason for him to. He was a crew lead on a construction project. He had done what he had done, and it was in other people's hands now. He spent the morning running the last of the finish electrical on floor 14. The work was quiet, the kind that let your mind move, and he let it go where it wanted. The night before, she had told him about the audit. She had suspected irregularities in the materials account for months. Small discrepancies that were easy to explain away individually, but added up to a pattern if you looked at all of them together. She had initiated it quietly, without telling the board, because she hadn't known yet who on the board she could trust. "I suspected something," she had said. "I didn't know what it was." He had nodded. He understood that particular kind of certainty, the kind that lived in the body before the mind caught up with it. At 11:42 in the morning, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Des, who had apparently been sitting in his van since 8 o'clock, waiting for news from a source he wouldn't name. The message said, 5 to 1. Garrett read it. He set his tools down, told the guys he needed 20 minutes, and drove to the Ashby Group building. He had not planned this. There had been no arrangement, no agreement that he would come. He simply drove there and parked in the visitor structure and rode the elevator to the lobby and sat down in one of the chairs near the security desk, where light came in from the street and a small fountain ran in the corner that nobody seemed to pay any attention to. He sat there for 12 minutes. The elevator opened. Saren came out, still carrying a legal pad, a phone, and a folder tucked under her arm, coming directly from the boardroom. She stopped when she saw him. She was still wearing the expression that a room like that required, controlled, composed, every surface attended to. But something in it shifted when she registered that he was there. It was very small. He saw it. "How did you know when it ended?" she said. "Des texted me." She looked at him for a moment. Then, 5 to 1. "The board voted 5 to 1 not to open an investigation into my conduct." She paused. "They voted 4 to 2 to open one into Holt's." Holt was the one dissenting vote. "Yes." He nodded. There wasn't much to say. It had gone the way the evidence said it should go, which was not always the way things went, and so it felt correct, rather than surprising, like a joint that had finally seated properly after a long time of being slightly off. "He'll resign," Saren said. "Before the audit finishes, he'll have his lawyers negotiate a quiet exit. Probably. And the project continues." "Right." She looked at him. The controlled expression had not changed exactly, but there was something underneath it that was newer, something that looked like relief, or its closest neighbor. She almost never let things show. He had come to understand this about her over the past few weeks. The way you came to understand things about people you were paying careful attention to. You came down here to wait, she said. I didn't have anything better to do. You had a job to finish. The guys can manage the last of it. He stood. I just wanted to know how it came out. She held the elevator door open. He walked toward it. They rode up together without speaking, and the city fell away beneath them floor by floor. When the elevator stopped, neither of them moved to leave immediately. She smiled, really smiled, the kind that didn't look like the one she used in meetings. It was small and passed quickly. It was enough. 3 weeks later, Ashby Tower cleared its final inspection. Des brought 2 extra-large pizzas to the site. The Floor 14 crew ate on overturned buckets in the lobby, while the building staff watched through the glass partition, with expressions suggesting this was not the typical handover protocol. Des was in the middle of a story about a job in 2016 that had gone catastrophically wrong in 3 different states, and the story was improving with every telling. Garrett sat against the wall, ate his pizza, and felt something resolve inside him. Not just the job, something else. Something that had been sitting slightly off-center for longer than he could accurately name. Holt's resignation was announced the following Monday, in the careful language of a company that had decided not to make public anything it didn't have to. The full audit concluded 2 weeks after that. The materials irregularities were referred to the appropriate authorities. None of it made the news. These things rarely did when both sides had lawyers who understood the value of a quiet exit. The crew's completion bonus arrived in full. Des sent Garrett a single period in a text, which was how he indicated that something had gone correctly. Holt's exit made the air in the building change without anyone being able to say exactly why. The crew felt it. Des mentioned it once, between jobs, and Garrett nodded, and that was the end of it. Some things didn't need to be said at length to be understood. They had done what they'd done, and the work had continued, and that was generally how the best outcomes looked from the inside. Unremarkable. Just the next thing moving into place. Garrett was giving Nola a bath on a Friday evening when his phone buzzed on the counter. The text was from Saren. Are you still up? He typed back. Yes. She typed, I'm nearby. Can I stop by? Nola surfaced from under the water. Who was that? Someone I know from work, he said. Are they nice? Yeah, he said. I think so. Nola considered this with the gravity of someone making a preliminary determination, then went back under. He got her into bed, 2 chapters, 1 glass of water, 1 negotiation about the hall light that he ultimately lost, and at 8:45 he opened the door for Saren Ashby, who was holding a bottle of wine that had cost less than $12 and was making no apology for it. They sat at the kitchen table. He opened the wine. They talked until after 10, not the provisional conversation of that first night at the bar, and not the careful measured talking of offices and formal rooms. 2 people who had been looking at each other through various kinds of glass and had decided, more or less at the same time, to stop. She talked about 2019, about what it was like to spend 3 weeks in a hospital bed discovering she didn't know who she was when she wasn't in charge of anything, about a letter that had arrived with no return address and said something she had needed to hear without knowing she needed to hear it. He refilled her glass and said nothing. He understood that some things were better received in silence. She left at 11:15. He walked her to the door. She stopped on the threshold. Next Friday, she said. Not a question. Yeah, he said. Next Friday. She nodded once and walked to the elevator. He stood in the doorway until it opened, then went inside and closed the door and stood in the quiet. He went to check on Nola. She was asleep with her book still open beside her. He closed it carefully and turned off the light and thought about Fridays and the space between one and the next, and how he had stopped dreading them somewhere along the way without noticing when. 3 weeks after that, on a Sunday morning in Pilsen, Garrett and Nola were standing at a produce stall in the farmer's market when Saren appeared. She was moving through the crowd at the unhurried pace of someone with nowhere particular to be, carrying a canvas bag, wearing the expression of someone who had made a decision before leaving the house and was comfortable with it. Nola saw her first. She looked up at the woman, then back at her father, with the focused attention of a 7-year-old forming a careful assessment. "Is that the person you text?" Nola asked. Garrett did not answer immediately. Saren had seen them. She crossed to the stall without hurrying, stopped in front of Nola, and crouched down to her level, eye to eye, and extended her hand the way you did when you were being introduced to someone you wanted to take seriously. "I'm Saren," she said. Nola shook her hand with great deliberateness. "Your name is hard to say," she said. "My dad says so." Saren looked up at Garrett. Her expression was patient and steady and slightly amused in a way she wasn't trying to hide. "Does he?" Garrett looked at the apples he was holding and had no defense to offer. The three of them moved through the market together. Nola walked between them with her bag of apples swinging, explaining at full speed and full volume why butterflies were actually frightening when you thought about it carefully, a position she had recently extended to include moths, beetles, and anything else with wings. She had assembled this view with some care, and was prepared to defend it. Saren listened to all of it. She asked one question, and it was a good question, and Nola stopped walking briefly to consider it with the gravity it deserved before continuing. Garrett and Saren walked beside each other without talking, just moving through the crowd, just listening. The market was full around them, carrying the particular warm noise of a Sunday morning in the neighborhood, vendors and dogs and strollers, and the smell of fresh bread from the stall near the end of the row. Nola had been asking, in the casual investigative way she approached most things, what it was like to have a friend who was also a boss. Garrett had said he wasn't sure yet. She had accepted this as a reasonable answer and moved on to a separate inquiry about whether dragonflies had feelings. He had said he didn't know. She had said that was okay. She would figure it out. He wasn't thinking about the morning he had woken up and turned his head and found her asleep beside him. He wasn't running through what had happened and what it meant and what came next. He was just walking, in the city he had always lived in, with his daughter explaining the precise reasons that dragonflies were the single most alarming thing in nature, and a woman beside him who had kept a letter for 6 years and folded it soft at the creases. He didn't need to know what had happened that night. He already knew what was happening now, and he thought that this, the next Sunday morning, and the one after that, was the thing he actually wanted to know about.